The Bible story of Esther, a queen's courage to save her people. Welcome to Biblical Wonders, where we take a journey through the rich tapestry of biblical history. Today, we will explore one of the most extraordinary stories in the Bible, a tale of courage, divine providence, and the salvation of a people. It is the story of Queen Esther, a young woman who rose from humble beginnings as an orphan to become the Queen of Persia. In a time of great peril, Esther displayed remarkable bravery and wisdom, risking her own life to save her people from genocide. Through her story, we learn the profound impact one individual can have when they trust in God's purpose and act with faith. The book of Esther is unique in that it never mentions the name of God directly. Yet through the story of Esther's courage, we see God's hand at work, guiding and protecting his people. It's a story that reminds us that even when we cannot see God directly, he is always working behind the scenes, orchestrating events to fulfill his promises. Esther's rise to power. In the pages of the Bible, we encounter many individuals who rise to greatness against the odds. Among them is Esther, a young Jewish woman who would rise from humble beginnings to become one of the most powerful figures in the Persian Empire. But her story is not just about the crown she would wear or the royal court she would command. It is a story of divine timing, obedience, and courage. Esther's life begins in humility, as an orphan, yet she would play a pivotal role in saving her people from certain destruction. The story of Esther begins in the Persian city of Susa, one of the capitals of the empire. Her birth name was Hadassah, and she was raised by her cousin Mordecai after her parents passed away. Mordecai, a faithful Jew, was not only her guardian, but also a mentor who would guide her through life's most challenging circumstances. In the historical context of the time, the Jewish people were living as exiles under Persian rule. They were scattered throughout the empire, with little power or influence. Yet, through God's mysterious workings, Esther's story would unfold in a way that would change the course of history. Esther's early life was marked by difficulties. As an orphan, she had little more than Mordecai's love and the teachings of her Jewish faith to guide her. Yet, despite these hardships, she was raised with a deep sense of integrity, wisdom, and strength, qualities that would prove invaluable as her life took an unexpected turn. Esther chapter 2, verse 7 beautifully reflects her upbringing. Mordecai had a cousin named Hadassah, whom he had brought up because she had neither father nor mother. This young woman, who was also known as Esther, had a lovely figure and was beautiful. Esther's physical beauty was not just an outward characteristic, it was a reflection of her inner strength and grace, which would serve her well in the court of King Xerxes. But it was not only her beauty that set Esther apart. It was her obedience to God's will and the counsel of her cousin Mordecai that would define her destiny. The turning point in Esther's life came when the king of Persia, Xerxes I, decided to replace his queen Vashti after she refused to obey his commands. In a fit of anger, the king had banished Vashti, and a search was made throughout the empire for a new queen. This was the moment that would alter the course of history for both Esther and the Jewish people. In Esther 2:8-9, the text recounts how Esther was brought into the palace. When the king's order and edict had been proclaimed, many young women were brought to the citadel of Susa and put under the care of Hegai. Esther also was taken to the king's palace and entrusted to Hegai, who had charge of the harem. At first, it might have seemed like just another event in the king's quest to find a new queen, but for Esther, this moment was marked by the divine hand of God. As Esther entered the palace, she was placed under the care of Hegai, the king's eunuch, who managed the harem. Hegai found favor in her just as the king would later. It was God's plan, though unseen, that worked through the royal court. Esther, despite being a Jewish exile, was chosen to join the king's harem. The process of preparation for a queen was long and arduous. Each woman would undergo a period of beauty treatments and training, preparing her to meet the king. Through it all, Esther was humble, obedient, and patient. She took the advice of Haggai and others in the court, making decisions that would earn her the king's favor. In Esther 2:17, we read, "Now the king was attracted to Esther more than to any of the other women, and she won his favor and approval more than any of the other virgins. So he set a royal crown on her head and made her queen instead of Vashti." Esther's rise to the throne was not a result of her own ambition or desire for power. It was the fulfillment of God's purpose for her life. It was God who orchestrated the events that led to her becoming queen, placing her in a position of great influence for a time when the survival of her people would depend on her. Esther was not only chosen by the king, she was also chosen by God. And though she had found favor with the king, she was still a Jewish exile in a foreign land, and her true identity was known only to a select few. Mordecai, ever vigilant, had instructed her not to reveal her Jewish heritage when she was brought into the palace. This act of discretion was part of God's greater plan, keeping Esther's identity hidden until the right time. Esther's rise to power is a testament to the mysterious workings of God's providence. God often uses the ordinary, a young orphaned girl, to accomplish his divine purposes. He places us in circumstances that at the time might seem trivial or even harmful, but when we look back, we see how he was guiding us all along. In Esther's case, the young girl from an oppressed Jewish family would be positioned in a place of royalty where she could change the fate of her people. And now, as we move into the next segment, we will delve into the tension that arises within the Persian Empire. The calm of the royal court will soon be disrupted by a wicked plot that threatens the very survival of the Jewish people. Haman, the king's advisor, would soon set in motion a devious scheme to exterminate the Jews, and Esther's courage would be tested in ways she could never have imagined. In the next segment, we will witness how Esther, once a humble orphan, would take a stand for her people and risk everything to confront the king. The threat to the Jews, Haman's plot. As we step deeper into the unfolding drama of Esther's story, we find that the peace and prosperity she has found as queen are soon shattered by a growing threat, one that will test not only her faith but also her bravery. The tranquility of the royal court is suddenly disturbed by Haman, a high-ranking official who, driven by pride and hatred, devises a plot to exterminate the Jewish people. The story of Haman's plot serves as a poignant reminder of how evil can sometimes manifest in the highest echelons of power, and how God's chosen people are often caught in the crossfire of such schemes. Haman was a man of significant power, serving as the king's advisor and chief official in the Persian court. His rise to prominence, however, did not come without its flaws. Haman, as we are told in Esther 3:1, had been elevated to the highest position in the kingdom, second only to King Xerxes himself. Yet, despite this, pride and a desire for control consumed him. His actions toward the Jewish people were driven not just by personal vendettas, but by a deep-seated hatred for the Jews. The seeds of this hatred were sown when Mordecai, Esther's cousin, refused to bow down to him in homage as all others did. Esther 3:2 tells us, "All the royal officials at the king's gate knelt down and paid honor to Haman, for the king had commanded this concerning him. But Mordecai would not kneel down or pay him honor." This small act of defiance, Mordecai's refusal to bow before Haman, ignited a fury within the official that would soon spread like wildfire. Haman, in his arrogance, saw Mordecai's refusal not just as an insult, but as an affront to his authority. Haman's rage at Mordecai quickly grew, and he became obsessed with the idea of punishing the Jews as a whole for what he perceived as their disrespect. In Esther 3, verses 5 and 6, we read of how Haman's hatred began to take shape. When Haman saw that Mordecai would not kneel down or pay him honor, he was enraged. Yet having learned who Mordecai's people were, he scorned the idea of killing only Mordecai. Instead, Haman looked for a way to destroy all Mordecai's people, the Jews, throughout the whole kingdom of Xerxes. Driven by his hatred, Haman then goes before King Xerxes and uses his influence to deceive the king into signing an edict to wipe out all Jews in the empire. Haman presents his case as a threat to the king's power, saying that the Jews do not follow the laws of the kingdom and that they would eventually undermine his reign. In Esther 3, 8 and 9, Haman states, "There is a certain people dispersed among the peoples in all the provinces of your kingdom who keep themselves separate. Their customs are different from those of all other people, and they do not obey the king's laws. It is not in the king's best interest to tolerate them." Haman's words appeal to the king's pride and his desire for control. He convinces Xerxes to grant him the authority to carry out this genocidal plot, and the king, who is unaware of Esther's true identity as a Jew, agrees. In Esther chapter 3, verses 10 to 11, the king gives his signet ring to Haman. So the king took his signet ring from his finger and gave it to Haman, son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, the enemy of the Jews. "Keep the money," the king said to Haman, "and do with the people as you please." This moment marks a turning point in the story of Esther and her people. The decree has been issued, and the Jewish people are now living under the shadow of death. They are unaware of the plot at this moment, but the cruelty of Haman's decision is clear. The lives of thousands of innocent people are now in jeopardy, not because of their actions, but because of the hatred of one man whose pride clouded his judgment. The decree was sent out to all the provinces of Persia, instructing that on a certain day the Jews were to be slaughtered and plundered. But God's providence was not dormant during this crisis. His hand was at work, orchestrating events to bring about a deliverance that would be impossible by human effort alone. With this dark and ominous decree in place, the Jewish people were gripped with fear. The message had spread like wildfire, and the people mourned, fasted, and cried out to God for mercy. But Esther, as queen, was in a position to intervene, though she could not yet see how her courage would be the key to salvation. It was now time for Esther to face the challenge and risk everything for her people, knowing that her actions could result in her death if she misstepped. In the next segment, we will explore how Esther, despite the incredible danger and her own fears, chose to act with boldness, stepping into the king's court without being summoned, an act that would forever change the fate of the Jewish people. God's divine plan, Esther's role in deliverance. As the Jewish people in Susa face impending destruction, the weight of the decree is felt across the empire. Yet, in the midst of despair, Esther, now queen, holds the key to her people's salvation. But salvation will not come easily. It will require courage, sacrifice, and a willingness to put her own life at risk. The queen must now make the ultimate decision, to approach King Xerxes without his summons, knowing full well that this could lead to her death. This moment is a test of faith, a pivotal moment in the story, and Esther's actions will forever be etched in the history of Israel. Esther, despite her favor with King Xerxes, was not immune to the law of the land. It was a rule that applied to everyone. If you entered the king's inner court without being called, you risked death. The king would only grant mercy by extending his golden scepter to the one who entered uninvited. This law was rigid, designed to preserve the king's authority and protect him from potential intrigue within the palace. And yet, Esther knew that she had to risk this law, for the fate of her people depended on her willingness to stand before the king and plead for mercy. Esther's first reaction was one of fear and hesitation. She knew the gravity of the situation. Mordecai's message to her could not have been clearer. If she did not act, the Jewish people would face annihilation, but even more, she might never have another opportunity to make a difference. The Bible recounts Esther's own words in Esther 4:11, expressing her fear. All the king's officials and the people of the royal provinces know that for any man or woman who approaches the king in the inner court without being summoned, the king has but one law, that they be put to death unless the king extends the gold scepter to them and spares their lives. But 30 days have passed since I was called to go to the king. Esther's fear was genuine, and it was rooted in the laws of the Persian court. But this fear was quickly met by Mordecai's courage and his unwavering belief in God's sovereignty. Mordecai reminded Esther of a higher purpose, a purpose beyond her own fear or personal safety. He challenged her to see that she had been chosen for this moment, placed in the palace for just such a time as this. In Esther 4:14, Mordecai's words pierced Esther's heart. "Do not think that because you are in the king's house, you alone of all the Jews will escape. For if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance for the Jews will arise from another place, but you and your father's family will perish. And who knows but that you have come to your royal position for such a time as this?" Mordecai's words were not just a call to action, they were a prophetic declaration. Mordecai believed that God had a divine purpose for Esther's life. Even if she chose not to act, God would still bring about deliverance for his people. However, Mordecai urged Esther to consider the incredible opportunity she had. Esther was uniquely positioned, not just as a queen, but as a vessel for God's plan of deliverance. She could save her people, but only if she chose to risk her own life. At this crossroads, Esther had to make a decision: to remain silent or to step forward and speak for the salvation of her people. Her decision would not come easily, and it would require all of her faith and courage. It was a decision that carried with it the weight of destiny. Esther's response is one of deep faith and resolve. She did not hesitate, nor did she turn away from the challenge that lay before her. Instead, she embraced it. Esther sent a message back to Mordecai saying, "Go, gather together all the Jews who are in Susa and fast for me. Do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my attendants will fast as you do. When this is done, I will go to the king, even though it is against the law. And if I perish, I perish." Esther 4:15-16. With those words, Esther shows us a model of selflessness and courage in the face of grave danger. She knew the risks of approaching the king, but she also understood the immense responsibility she carried as the Queen of Persia and as a Jewish woman who could be the one to deliver her people. Esther's faith led her to trust not in her own abilities, but in God's sovereign plan. Her call for fasting and prayer was a pivotal moment in the story. She recognized that the battle she was facing was not just a political one, but a spiritual battle. She needed the intervention of God to overcome the powerful forces at play. Her obedience to God and her willingness to risk everything set the stage for the divine deliverance that would follow. The story of Esther is, at its core, a story of divine providence. While Esther took bold action, her courage was not driven by her own strength, but by her faith in God. And though God's name is not directly mentioned in the book of Esther, his presence is felt throughout the narrative. God's hand was at work in Esther's life from the very beginning, guiding her steps toward this moment of great courage. As we move into the next segment, we will see how Esther's bold step into the king's presence changed the course of history. Her courage would be the key to deliverance for her people, and in her obedience, we see a reflection of the profound impact one person can have when they trust in God's plan. Life in the Persian Empire, the status of women and Jews. As we have seen, Esther's act of courage was not just a bold move in the face of political intrigue and personal danger, but also a profound challenge to the social norms and cultural expectations of her time. To understand fully the magnitude of Esther's actions, we must look deeper into the context of the world in which she lived. The vast Persian Empire, a world where limitations, oppression, and vulnerability often defined the lives of women and the Jewish people. The Persian Empire, at the time of Esther's story, was one of the most powerful civilizations in the ancient world. Under the rule of King Xerxes, the empire stretched from India to Ethiopia, encompassing a vast and diverse range of peoples, cultures, and traditions. Yet, despite the empire's grandeur, there existed stark divisions, especially for women and minority groups like the Jews. Esther's life in the palace was not the life of a free woman. While she was queen, she still lived within a system that confined her actions. Persian women, regardless of their rank, were often subject to strict codes of behavior. For women like Esther, the luxury of royal status came with the constant tension of being controlled and monitored. Although Esther had achieved an incredible position within the court, her position as queen did not free her from the power dynamics of her society. The king, despite his affection for her, remained the ultimate authority, and his whims often determined the fate of those around him. Esther's role as queen meant that her identity was always linked to her relationship with the king. The fact that she was a Jewish woman in a pagan court only made her position even more precarious. In fact, her Jewish identity was initially kept secret. The Bible tells us in Esther 2:10 that she did not reveal her nationality and family background because Mordecai had forbidden her to do so. This was a necessary measure, as revealing her Jewish heritage could have jeopardized her position in the palace and put her at risk of being marginalized or persecuted. In a world where women's voices were silenced and minorities were often oppressed, Esther's courage stands out even more. She did not allow the constraints of her position to stop her from acting on behalf of her people. She broke free from the limitations placed on her gender and ethnicity, choosing to intervene in a situation where she could have easily remained silent and protected herself. As we contrast Esther's role with that of the average Jewish citizen in the Persian Empire, we gain further insight into the struggles that motivated her actions. For the Jews, life in the empire was marked by persecution and oppression. Though the Persian Empire had a reputation for tolerating many different peoples and faiths, the Jews were still seen as a minority group with little power. The decree issued by Haman was a reminder that, in the eyes of many, the Jews were still seen as outsiders, vulnerable and expendable. The Jewish people had experienced centuries of displacement, having been carried off into Babylonian exile long before the time of Esther. Though some had returned to Jerusalem to rebuild their temple, many Jews still lived scattered throughout the Persian Empire. These Jews, though allowed to practice their religion, had to navigate the constant tension between faithfulness to God and the expectations of the foreign lands in which they lived. Esther's heritage was not merely a footnote in her story. It was the reason she stood apart as both a woman and a Jew in the Persian court. Her Jewish identity had the potential to define her entire life. As she risked her life to save her people, she was also confronting the power structures of the time, ones that often oppressed both women and Jews alike. Her courage speaks volumes about the way God can use people, no matter their gender or ethnicity, to fulfill his purposes. The contrast between Esther's royal life and the daily lives of ordinary Jews is significant. While Esther lived in the lap of luxury as the queen, she was still under constant scrutiny and lived with the ever-present threat of violence and political intrigue. In contrast, the Jewish community lived in constant fear of persecution. The ordinary Jews who were not in positions of power like Esther were vulnerable and lived in the shadow of Haman's decree. For them, life was filled with uncertainty, and their faith in God was tested at every turn. As we reflect on the lives of the Jews and women in Persian society, we begin to see that Esther's story is about more than just the courage of one woman. It's about the collective fate of a people who had suffered oppression for generations, who had experienced displacement, persecution, and marginalization. Esther's courage and her willingness to risk everything for the sake of her people reflect the faithfulness of a people who held on to their identity in the face of the world's hostility. Her actions remind us that, even in the most difficult of circumstances, God can work through ordinary people, no matter their gender, their status, or their background, to bring about extraordinary change. It becomes clear that Esther's position as queen, though privileged, was filled with challenges that required her to rise above the norms of her society. She defied expectations, broke through societal constraints, and embraced a role that was not just a matter of power, but of divine purpose. Through Esther, we see how God used a woman in a time of patriarchal rule to bring about the deliverance of a people. While Esther lived in the royal palace, her Jewish heritage remained a secret, hidden from most of the court. This secret identity was necessary, as revealing that she was one of the Jewish people would have been dangerous. Jews in Persia, even though they were tolerated, were still seen as outsiders by many. The edict from Haman was a direct reflection of how the Jewish community was viewed, an expendable group, easily overlooked and even more easily destroyed. To Esther, this revelation had personal significance, but it also represented the wider vulnerability of her entire nation, scattered across the vast Persian Empire. The story of Esther reminds us that political power and social privilege are not always synonymous with freedom. Yes, she was queen, but her life was still deeply marked by constraints. Queen Esther lived within the boundaries of a male-dominated court and a system that often relegated women to symbolic roles rather than actual decision-making positions. Even though Esther had the ear of the king, her role as a woman meant that her influence, though significant, was often indirect. Her ability to navigate the complexities of the Persian court highlights her exceptional wisdom and insight. Xerxes, the king, was powerful, but not impervious to political machinations. As queen, Esther had to walk a delicate line between appeasing the king's desires and pleading for the survival of her people. Her position as queen also made her a political pawn, as her marriage was more a matter of statecraft than personal choice. Her courage was all the more remarkable in this light, for she was walking into a situation where any wrong move could cost her not just her life, but also the lives of countless others. As we consider the Jews' position in Persia, we see a people caught between two worlds. The Jews were part of the Persian Empire, but they were still a conquered people. They had no political rights of their own, and their religious practices were not always understood or tolerated by the Persian elite. Even though Persia had a reputation for tolerating a wide array of religions and cultures, the Jews were nonetheless subject to deep-seated prejudices and social inequalities. In the case of Haman's decree, this institutional hatred became deadly. Jews lived in a precarious balance, trying to maintain their identity while adapting to the foreign rule. The presence of Jewish communities in Persia, especially after their return from Babylonian exile, signifies a people striving for survival. They were subjugated to the whims of those in power, whether those whims came in the form of local governors or royal decrees. And, like most minorities, the Jewish people had to live quietly under the surface, resisting oppression and maintaining their faith in God despite the hostile environment. It is against this backdrop of oppression and vulnerability that we see Esther's profound act of courage. Her willingness to approach the king for the sake of her people was not just a matter of personal resolve, but it was a divinely ordained moment in history. God had placed Esther in the palace for such a time as this, to turn the tide in favor of her people. Her bravery showed that God's hand works in the most unpredictable of ways, even using the most unlikely person, a young Jewish woman placed in an elite palace, to become the instrument of salvation for a persecuted nation. Esther's story is a testimony to the fact that no matter how oppressed or marginalized a people might feel, God's providence is never far away. Esther was not a hero by accident. She was chosen, though she did not know it at first. She was the right person in the right place at the right time. Her faith, obedience, and willingness to sacrifice made her a key player in a larger divine plan. When we look at Esther's life, we are reminded that God uses ordinary people in extraordinary ways to accomplish His will, even when the circumstances seem overwhelming. In the broader context of Persian society, Esther's actions not only changed the fate of the Jews, but also challenged societal norms. She broke barriers that many of her contemporaries would never dare to challenge. Her role as a woman in a highly patriarchal society, her Jewish background in a pagan empire, and her personal humility in approaching the king made her an unlikely heroine, yet she fulfilled a role that would forever change the course of history. As we explore the impact of Esther's choices, we realize that she exemplifies the power of faith in action, the power to confront evil and to resist injustice in the face of overwhelming odds. Her faith in God, Her obedience to his calling and her courage in the face of personal risk are qualities that can inspire all of us today, especially in times of uncertainty or oppression. Esther's story reminds us that no matter how difficult or dangerous the situation may be, God can use us for his purposes. The power of one individual's faith and courage can make all the difference in the world. As we continue this journey through Esther's life, let us reflect on the importance of trusting in God's plan, even when the path ahead seems unclear or fraught with danger. We have explored Esther's courageous journey as she broke societal norms, defied the oppression around her, and trusted in God's plan. Her actions not only changed the fate of the Jewish people, but also set an example of faithfulness, courage, and obedience that transcends time. Esther's life shows us that God can use anyone, regardless of their position, to fulfill his divine purposes. As we reflect on her story, we are reminded of the importance of acting with faith and bravery, even in the face of overwhelming odds. As we come to the end of this video, we can take comfort in the truth that God is always at work, even in the most challenging situations. Whether in times of personal struggle, societal upheaval, or national crisis, we can trust that, like Esther, we too can be part of his divine plan. Just as God used her in a powerful way, he continues to call each of us to make a difference in his world. May we take inspiration from Esther's courage and always remember that we are never alone in our journey. God's plan is always at work, and with faith, we too can be part of it. Thank you for joining us on this Biblical Wonders journey. May you continue to find peace, understanding, and inspiration through the timeless stories of faith and divine intervention in the Bible.